Hey friends, I want to thank our sponsor, Raygun. Are you struggling to replicate the bugs and performance issues that your customers are reporting? Plug Raygun into your web and mobile applications right now and diagnose problems in minutes rather than hours. Kiss goodbye having to dig through log files and relying on frustrated users to report issues. Make your software development life so much easier using Raygun's error, crash, and performance monitoring tools. Every software team can create flawless software experiences for their customers with Raygun. Try it free today at raygun.com. That's RAYGUN.com. Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Dr. Mireille Reece. She's a clinical psychologist from Silverdale, Washington. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
You have got a great podcast called Brain Science at changelog.com/brain science. And I've, without realizing it, been talking to a number of people in the kind of clinical psychology space, thinking about burnout and depression and anxiety. I don't feel like I have any of those things, but it is significant that without realizing it, people are showing up in my life in this space. So I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm excited to share this because, brain science and really our hope for the podcast is really not just what we know about the brain, but how what we know about the brain can affect how we do our lives and ourselves. And so it's all about utility.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're in a world where we're all under a microscope because so many people are on social media, but then also we have so much data. And I think a lot of us are overwhelmed with data, whether that data be emails that I'm not going to read or, people that are coming into my life. I guess they're data as well.
Amen. Yeah, it is. All these things, like we take in information through our senses and our brain is always trying to make sense of it. It's interesting because I always say it's not the eyes that see or the ears that hear, but how our brain puts that puzzle together.
That's very interesting. And as we are in a situation where, facts themselves are unclear as things are coming at us and we all interpret them differently, everything is up for interpretation now. There's this article that I was reading on the New York Times, and I'll put it in the show notes, that is talking about Instagram and social media. And it primarily focuses on women and how they feel about social media, but it's about being real. Mm-hmm. How can we be ourselves when we are observed? I think is the essence of the question.
Well, yes, and part of that is that how other people see you and how you see yourself aren't necessarily the same. And I'm not ever in charge of anybody else's perception. It was interesting having children. I always get the opportunity to expose myself to things I hadn't planned on. And one of those things recently was actually an experience with VR. So I go to my son's friend's birthday party, and I had an opportunity to do this game, so to speak, where I did this elevator experience. So I go up the elevator, and then there's a plank when the door opens that I can walk off of. Okay. And so I'm going up and I'm taking in all the data, which is like the beautiful elevator music and, the buttons on the elevator, and the doors open and here's skyscrapers and sky and birds. And so knowing what I know about the brain, I know I'm standing on the ground, but yet my eyes, my visual system is taking in this data that is alternative to other data points I know. And so I literally got down and actually touched the ground beside the plank.
Confirmation.
Yeah, but I had to take in additional information in order to tell my brain that what I was seeing wasn't actually legitimate.
Oh, I took my sons to one of these called tree-to-tree situations where they link you up on a tree and you're like 100 feet up on a ridiculous tree in the middle of a forest, and you're very much belayed. You're linked in. Like there's no chance that you're going to fall and die. Right. And they're like, yeah, walk between this tree and that tree. And it's like on a rope or a single string or a piece of fishing line. And I watched my kids just say, oh, so you're telling me that this won't kill me? And then they like yank on it twice and they go, okay, I believe you. And then they just go and they go running. It's like, oh my, what are you doing? I had never felt, I got a headache that I'd never seen before. It was almost like the lizard part of my brain that has spent near 50 years trying to keep me from dying.
Right. Yes.
Could not be shut off.
Yes. You're exactly right. And that's so much. So when we're faced with some of these alternative data points, imagine that we have these different aspects of our brain that come into play. And what we're really trying to manage so much of the time is how not to die. Like
Wow,
our
that's
brain is
morbid but true.
right. Our brain is always first and foremost, its primary gig is trying to keep us alive. And so when we're activated in that place of threat, whether it's on social media or up in a tree, we tend to see far and we see narrow. So there could
Mm.
be a rope beside me, or there could be some other life preserver. However, my brain isn't apt to see it because the way in which my brain is wired, if there's a saber-toothed tiger, I need to see it from far away. I don't need to take in all of the data. I need to narrow my focus and see what's essential.
As I struggle to as I struggle to raise these children, I keep wanting to encourage them to look at the long game. Like think
Mm-hmm.
about after high school, and think about after college, and think about when you're 30, and they literally can't think past Tuesday.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the older I get, the farther in the future that I see, and most of my goals and goal setting are all set
Long
out in the
range.
future, long range as well. I didn't realize that my focus has changed.
Yeah, well, part of that is the development of the frontal lobe. So, frontal lobe, right there in the foremost frontal part of your head, right behind your skull,
Mm-hmm.
is this part of our brain that's responsible for what we call executive function. And so, if you think of everything that an executive assistant does,
Mm-hmm.
so they're looking at part to whole relationships like now and later. It's how fast you process information, it's how you problem solve. It's how you shift between two different things in terms of attention. And the thing is that doesn't begin to really come online more until adolescence. And it isn't fully cooked, so to speak, until like mid 20s for women and usually later 20s for boys or men.
Or mid 40s, depending on who you ask.
Well, and the other fascinating thing about this is that dopamine, which is our feel-good neurotransmitter, it's like anytime we do something that feels good, you can say, thank you, dopamine. This works the same in adolescents that it does in adults. But yet, you don't have that braking system, that impulse control that part of the frontal lobe is responsible for until later in life. So it's like, oh, that sounds fun. Let's just go ahead and try it.
Yeah, okay. So this explains why all of the "don't eat that candy, you'll rot your teeth" messaging is being lost on my people.
Amen. Yeah, they just don't care. And really, we talk about this in some of our episodes about forming habits, that our brains don't really care about what is going to happen long range, because part of what you're doing, Scott, is holding both intention and that I need to do what feels good now, but also that's going to benefit me in the future. And so I will, I will embrace to some degree the suck of whatever I'm doing because I know it's going to pay off.
Well, and I'm also older because I remember all of the suck, and I know that a little bit of suck now can make a lot more comfort later. So I'm able to
Right.
make
So
trade-offs across time.
yeah. And so this is really important when it comes to learning. And that what I really work hard with both patients and my children is I reinforce their effort and the frustration tolerance with the effort, so that I'm not so fixated on an outcome. Because like we talked about earlier, that outcome, I'm trying to manage threat or the possibility of a future threat. They don't really care.
Okay. So if we pivot a little bit, hopefully not awkwardly, and we think about developers and techies and IT people, there is an amount of willpower, but there's an amount of mental exercise, I think, that is required perhaps in the developer or the technical person's brain that maybe isn't as much in other jobs. I mean, every job you're always learning, but one of the things we talk about when we think about programmers and techies is the absolute requirement that you always learn, lest you get into obsolescence much faster than if you were in another job.
Right. But so that is challenging. So I'd say that requires a high degree of cognitive load. And you're doing a lot of frontal lobe functions. So in the same way you could like drive a long distance, and you might be incredibly fatigued by the end of the day, but you didn't really do a lot of activity. It's because you had attention and you were still utilizing motor systems, memory systems. Like your brain was fully frontal.
Is that why we
So,
hurt so much after these long days? It's a different kind of hurt, though. My wife is a nurse, and she comes home and physically hurts because she's
yeah.
standing all day. And I come home and I'm
Mm-hmm.
just a useless mess because I've been, I don't know, head forward
Yeah.
all this time.
Yeah, and you're utilizing, so even the way in which like memory works, like you guys and attention, which is a sort of all in one gig.
Mm-hmm.
We need attention in order to have memory. But you guys are holding different things conceptually simultaneously and set shifting between
Mm-hmm.
them over and over and over again, and then having to problem solve. So going, how does this data point relate to that data point? How does this system work? And how can I translate this information? So just like a physical muscle under tension is going to give out,
Mm.
so it will with our brains.
Can I use this information now to make things better? Is this simply a matter of knowing that this is a thing now can make me have more control of it?
Yeah, exactly. So thinking about it, I think it was recently you had Dr. Simons on and talking about the concept of burnout with managing resources. And so I know this, and we're trained in this as psychologists around, I know that what I'm using in all of my work with my patients is myself. Furthermore, I'm taking on a lot of energy because I'm dealing with emotions that people either are aware of or are not aware
Mm-hmm.
of. And so I make decisions all the time around an allocation of my energy. And I would say that it really shifted, one, when I had one child, but definitely felt it when I had two,
Mm-hmm.
because I was sharing my resources, my mental energy with more than just myself and my husband.
That is why caregivers burn out so much, is that they're chopping off pieces of energy and giving it to someone else and forgetting that it has to be replenished.
Exactly. And so I'll even make decisions around different work demands so that I allocate energy according to the greatest priority or the hardest thing. Like I learned really early on to always start with the hardest thing. And that might be the thing that like takes the most amount of cognitive bandwidth, but it could also be the thing that I am most aversive to.
And that is maturity and frontal lobe, like executive function. Because last night at 10:30 at night, my 12-year-old said that they have a paper due and it's due in 90 minutes. And I was just like, you could have been doing this at any time in the last 3 weeks.
Mhm.
So what you're able to do because you're grown, they
Right.
were not able to do yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. But so all of this sort of planning and allocating and recognizing too that in different seasons of
Mm-hmm.
life, or like be it you have aging parents or somebody else with health issues, like if I'm remembering correctly, your wife battled
Mm-hmm.
cancer. And I'm certain that during that season of time that your energy was different than what it is today when she's not ill.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, 5 years later, the echoes remain and the side effects remain. So those moments of energy go up and down based on how we are all feeling that particular day.
Right. And so I always talk about this because I don't want people, like, knowing doesn't help me do myself any better. So just the pure knowledge doesn't change anything. But acknowledging that, say, this task or, a certain thing I'm trying to develop, app I'm working on, is hard for me or more challenging, then I'm going to identify an action. So I want to acknowledge and then act. So I'm going to sort of write my own prescription over what I could do differently. Like I would offer, from my understanding, that with your wife, you guys journaled.
Yes.
Like during that whole time. And so you really operated by this name it to tame it principle, so that the more that you could articulate or put words to the experience, it was as though you were creating your own Dewey Decimal System of it. So it defragged all of that mental energy because you knew where to put it.
That is true, though. Like you say, name it to tame it. Sometimes in software engineering, we say name it and claim it. When we talk about naming objects, the idea of
Okay.
naming something has power. If you have an undiagnosed disease, it is extremely difficult. But once you get a name for it, it still sucks. It just
Right.
sucks measurably differently.
Correct, because you then can look at what can I do while this is the case. And so that's what I would say when you're talking about sort of managing cognitive load of going, while this particular thing is challenging, I'm going to reallocate my energy accordingly.
Could this be a bad thing? I feel like that when, a very long time ago, there were fewer peanut allergies, there were fewer anxiety and ADHD diagnoses. I'm sure all of those things existed, except the name didn't exist. When we start naming something, whether it be clinically or otherwise, it can give a lot of people power, but it can also give people even more anxiety because they can name something and claim it for themselves, but it might not be theirs.
Well, so this is the other thing. Where attention goes, energy flows.
Mm.
So the more that I focus on something, I'm feeding my attention towards that. So it doesn't help me just focus on a challenge and like, this sucks, or this is hard. And yes, this is why I'm struggling. But rather, what else can I do as to buffer that?
That sounds like the clinical version of like, don't worry about the haters.
Well, it's going, what do I do with them? Like, how would I approach it? Would I be like, you know what? I'm going to look at all of the messages and I'm going to spend 15 minutes and just like go all in. We would call this flooding in terms of exposure therapy. I'm just going to flood myself with all of the junk I don't want to hear. And then I'm going to go do something that actually feels really good.
Hey folks, I'm taking this episode to advertise for other podcasts. If you enjoy stories about the people behind the technology that we use, you should check out the Greater Than Code podcast. They focus on the human side of software development with stories of diversity and inclusion, accessibility from people that you don't normally hear from. Search for Greater Than Code in your favorite podcast app or check out greaterthancode.com. That's really interesting. So it's so funny to hear like the kind of more official or more, like what a clinical psychologist like yourself knows to be true because research shows it and experience shows it and many years show it versus parental wisdom, which is oftentimes made up. But one of the greatest tips that my mom ever gave me, and I've said this in talks before and I'll say it now, is, oh, wow, you feel bad, don't you? Yeah, I feel bad, Mom. Well, put a time limit on it. Pick a time. It could be 15 minutes, could be 6 weeks, but pick a time, set a timer, feel as bad as you can, and then stop. And she was basically doing flooding. She's like, yeah, sit here and cry. And like, you got an F on that test. It sucks. It doesn't work for everything, but it has been one of the number one tips for me. It's just flood, know it, accept it, let it wash over you, and then move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And this is at the heart of what it means, like even all of the different things we're talking about with like anxiety and willpower. And that really what I want to do is cultivate resiliency so that when I get knocked down, I can learn how to get back up. Because oftentimes what happens, such as in the case with anxiety or phobias, I will have an experience that feels incredibly abrasive and deleterious to myself. And so then I'll practice avoiding that thing that was unpleasant. However, by doing that, I forfeit the data because I think it's actually going to help me. But I forfeit finding out that I could feel differently by exposing myself to it.
Interesting. So we are in a world where we have very, very often, very appropriately trigger warnings for content and things like that, which are very much a place where someone needs to protect themselves from something that could be sincerely damaging. But then I hear people using the term anxiety or I feel anxious when I maybe wouldn't use that word. Like if you were going to give a big presentation, how would you know when that's dangerous data or when it's actually potentially positive?
Well, so this is part of even that decision-making and identifying in the experience and going, I wouldn't call it anxiety because anxiety usually involves a sense of threat. And while that might be threatening to you if I'm going to give a presentation, right? Because I don't know what people are going to actually hear versus what I actually said, because that doesn't always go together, right? Because everybody's got a different filter and way in which they put together pieces of information. And so I would look at, asking myself, is there actually an identifiable threat? Because if my brain's job is always to try to keep me alive, of course it's going to signal to me that I need to heed some warning. But in the same way that monopoly money won't work the same as regular money, I need to be able to differentiate and sort of categorize anxiety as it relates to something that's going to move me in a direction of growth versus one that's going to move me in direction of threat.
I love that monopoly money idea. I just had this image of yeah, I'm super anxious. I'm very anxious. I'm having an anxiety attack, but it's a monopoly money anxiety attack, right? And it's bad.
Yeah.
It hurts in the moment, but ultimately it's not going to change. So you're saying that a positive anxiety can be a fuel that one can tap into, not to disparage or discount anyone's legitimate threat-based anxiety, but positive anxiety is really the anticipation of something that may not be as threatening as we think it is.
Right. And that's not to say like it's interesting because a lot of what people tend to be afraid of or fearful of for the future is something that's already happened to them.
How do you mean?
In the sense that I've already encoded that data, and so my brain knows that that's threatening because once upon a time it was.
But maybe it's not now, today.
Right. So imagine I'm deconditioning my brain around something that did happen in the past, but is not actively occurring.
Okay. So analogy time or direct experience analogy. So I've been recently taking Taekwondo, and it's something that I've learned that I should have done 20 years ago. And I just now discovered this sport, and I did a tournament, and in the tournament I got, somewhat hurt. Like, bust your toe hurt, kind of hurt, but not legitimately hurt. And I was really on full speed, like the same headache that I got when I was trying to climb those trees, which was like, I'm going to freaking die. But then I did my second tournament, and I went into it completely different. I just realized that this other middle-aged older man who is also taking Taekwondo, but just lives in a different neighborhood, is not legitimately trying to kill me with his feet. It sounds silly, but I was like, I'm going to get my beat. And I didn't. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this is another, fat guy from the other side of town. And when I went into it with this idea that, I probably get hurt, I might get a bruise or two, and I did, but this person was not trying to kill me. And it completely changed how I looked at the thing.
Yes, this is so huge because it is. Your brain is firing. Like, it's so crazy. So research is, I'm fascinated by. And so somebody thought of doing a research study around building thumb strength. Okay. And they looked at whether or not you actually build strength in your thumb by picturing it or doing it. Because a lot of athletes use visualization as a method for training. And what was fascinating is that people actually cultivated strength in their thumb, albeit not to the same degree, but strength nonetheless, by simply picturing it. Because neurons that fire together wire together. So the more that I think a thought, the more that I practice seeing things a certain way, I'm building a network in my brain that says this is the way to work we go.
Well, then we need to understand why I don't have a six-pack, because I have been thinking about it for quite a few decades, but it's not working that way.
Yes, but how much activity are you taking?
I'm thinking about it. If I got credit for every time I thought about working out, I would be amazing at this point. But
right, but you had the live event. And so you actually had the emotional experience with the thoughts. And so it was far more comprehensive.
I see. Okay, so that is the difference. So sitting down and visualizing my Taekwondo practice does fire certain neurons. It just doesn't do the complete package. It's the virtual reality version of actually doing it.
Correct.
One is more inclusive and more complete.
Right. And so part of what I would offer in these situations when you have anxiety in doing a job or with people is that you imagine using more of your whole brain, that we want all access to all of your brain. And so when you're activated or perceiving a sense of threat, you're spot on in saying it was more like your reptilian brain at play. And look, I can have super long conversations with lizards about what they should do and how they should act, but they don't really care.
Yeah, their scope of goals, their planning, their future looking is all limited.
No, exactly. If I am an alligator and I see a baby, I'm not going to reason it out and think I shouldn't eat a baby because I think they're going to hurt me.
That got really dark. This may be the first time that ever came up on the show in all these episodes. Which actually brings me to another interesting question. When we think about being a programmer or being a techie, I was working with my mentorship group. I've got some young people that I mentor, and one of them said, "There's a lot more squishy bits than I thought there would be." I was like, "What do you mean by squishy bits?" I was like, "Well, I thought I was going to be here to like do deep analysis, and I would be like, my technical ability would be challenged for the next 30 years, and that would be my career. But I have to keep dealing with all these humans, and they don't
Yes.
do the stuff that I
Yeah.
want them to do."
Isn't that the truth? So, my husband always has said since our children were young and as they've grown up, he's like, 7 or 47, it doesn't make a difference because we still have to learn how to navigate ourselves while other people make choices we wouldn't make, think things we wouldn't think, and do things we wouldn't do.
And it's the little stuff. Like if you listen to one of the shows with my wife, like we've been living in this house for 12 years. She still turns left at the light and I turn right at the light, and we are both convinced that that's the quickest way home. And it's like,
Yes.
why do you insist on that? Like, why do your fool's errand that you're going right at the light? Everyone knows going left at the light is the only true
Right.
way.
Yes. But, could you convince the other one that, the other way is right? And would that really matter? Who's
And
right?
that's the essence right there. So when you are dealing with these decisions and these decision points, my wife and I actually made a kind of a pact or a contract with each other where we said, I was okay before you, and I would be okay
I
after
love
you.
it.
And I don't want to be here after you. But just to be clear, I was kind of kicking butt in life before you came
Right.
around. So let's just know that when things
Yeah.
aren't, when you're frustrated or you think I can't reboot the
Right.
router, I will probably be able to figure out how to reboot the router.
Well, and so with that, I would offer that there's a big difference in how it feels when we're connected to others as opposed to complying with others.
Woo! You got all
Yeah.
the little nuggets there, don't you?
Well, I think it's super helpful because, how we remember will help us do ourselves differently in these situations. And so if I am to say that somebody else has to look like I do, think like I do like I do, I am forfeiting all of what they have to offer as a unique human. And that's what makes us beautiful. Like, I don't care about the same things that everybody else does, but that's a great, great, great thing because they go fight those fights and they build skills in order to change how that thing interacts or interfaces.
But we do have to agree on stuff though, like at some core level. Like, don't kill people and be nice.
Well, are we talking about morality or preference? Because this is it. I try to work really hard with people because we talk about this in cognitive distortions. When I am solely embedded in all or nothing or binary ways of thinking, then I'm apt to sort of say that there is a right and a wrong way to do things when there's just a way to do things. And if I'm going to talk about right and wrong, it should be far more applicable in the lane of morality. And that's why I don't kill people. Not whether it's right or wrong to turn right or left or to say yes or say no to a certain opportunity or a way to write code or not write it.
Okay, that is a really interesting point. Right. So in the computer world, we talk about pragmatists versus purists. And you look at two pieces of code and someone might say, well, this is the pure, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way that our ancestors wrote code. And, well, this is the one that works and it took, this many fewer lines and it's perfectly fine. That isn't a morality issue. You can frame it as one, but that would be a lie.
Yeah, because that's part of what makes the person human coming to the code. And if I want to be like you guys do a lot of things that involve creativity, and creativity, there's a component that is solely related to you. When I watch, I think kids are like the best sort of research lab because it's further enhancing data I've got. And so I watch the art teacher teach my kids or the whole class, these sort of, hey, we're going to make this picture. But which one of the 22 kids in the class looks the same? They look similar, but none are the same. And so I don't want to sit beside somebody else and tell them to diminish who they are so that I can feel okay about who I am.
That's a very positive and very well-oriented expression of the idea of inclusion. So if we deal with the morality of things, everyone should be able to have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is our
Sure.
morality. And then how you go about your life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness doesn't matter. As long as you have the right to exist and be appreciated and find people that love you, then do your thing.
Yeah, I would say we work better when we have a sense of respect and empathy for others. And that, I in working beside people who don't think like I do and don't do like I do, I also recognize that there's things that work better for people being able to work as a team or beside other people than other things. I mean, if I berate you and like go off to high heaven when you messed up on some task you were responsible for, that doesn't help you actually solve the problem, let alone want to hang out with the other person in any other way other than to get the task accomplished.
And that is the thing, right? Like we do have to hang out with these people afterwards. They are our coworkers or our wives and partners and husbands. Like we do, like, think about the decision you make. I need to say to my 12-year-old, like, that may or may not be correct, but you may also need to understand that person will be in class tomorrow as well.
Right. And look, I say, like, to some degree, we're all still learning. Like, when we raise kids, like, not everybody is launched with the same skill set or level of expertise. And so I want people to embrace this process of learning across all aspects of their life. And so we have to develop relational skills and emotional skills if we're going to even do our technological skills different. Because none of us get to opt out of humanity first and foremost.
As my dad always says, none of us are getting out of this alive.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think in terms, if I do anything binary, I look at whether things are adaptive or maladaptive. Do they work well or not work well? And so if I have an interaction with somebody else who, in my world comes across incredibly abrasive, I try to look at and go, in what way could I establish a common ground with this individual so that I could see more of their heart, their motivation in terms of what their effort is, as opposed to the way in which they present it to me or relate to me.
You've given me a lot to think about. And folks can hear more of what you have to say at changelog.com/brain science on the new Brain Science podcast. Everything from coping skills, humans and habits, relationships, managing mental health. You are a font of information. Dr. Mireille Reece, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much, Scott.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.